ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I welcome you very much to our second workshop on a series about changing energy flows that we have started a few weeks ago with a session with a, I think, very interesting, very inspiring workshop on East Med gas, the perspectives, the alternatives. And today we focus, for obvious reasons, on a subject that is discussed on both sides of the Atlantic, the Ukrainian crisis, Crimean crisis. What does that mean to our energy security? Especially, is shale gas coming via LNG to be exported by 2016? Is that an alternative? Is that a source that can substitute, if not all, the Russian quotas? At least, can it help to reduce the dependency that many of us in Europe feel is quite heavy? This institute has been based on the assumption of energy security, and energy security, as Winston Churchill has told us 100 years ago, means variety, variety, and variety alone. So he believed that the diversification of energy supplies is the key to energy security. So this institute is based on that assumption. That we don't want to depend on anybody, that we do not want to subject to pressures. And I don't know if you have ever seen our strategy paper, the first strategy paper that we published. It was written in 2010 by two scholars that are present here today and will speak to you, Frank Umbach and Maximilian Kuhn. And it was in 2010 already a study on shale gas. That was at a time when most people did not know that that really exists. So we're proud, quite proud that at that time we already said in the foreword that from a global perspective, unconventional gas has far-reaching geopolitical implication. It has the potential to balance the EU's energy equation by breaking a market dominated by a few suppliers, for instance Russia, and in the Middle East, where the vast majority of the conventional gas reserves are concentrated. So the whole idea that diversification is necessary, which we now discussed so vividly, was already the key subject of that paper. And while we believe that diversification is important, we want to ask the question, how realistic is it to have that substitute in the short term or in the medium term? And let me start out by coming up with a thesis. Again, I believe diversification is necessary. East Med gas, Northern Iraqian gas, perhaps Iranian gas, Azeri gas from the Caspian Sea, Shah Deniz, TAP, we have discussed this here time and again. And of course, shale gas coming via LNG tankers to Europe is a theoretical alternative. That is something where we have to work on. But in the years to come, it will hardly be possible to have a substantial reduction. First, because there are no LNG terminals right now in the US. First, exports will start end of 2015 earliest. Second, most of this LNG from the US will go to Asian markets because you get much more money in Asia. $19 per a million British thermal units vis-a-vis 11, which you can which you probably would ask for in Europe. So why should a company which has produced shale gas ship it to Europe and not to the Asian market where they can make more money? Do we have enough LNG tankers? We know how expensive they are, twice as much as a normal super tanker. We don't have enough of them to make, in the short run, substantial reductions. And thirdly, there's an ongoing debate in the United States whether one wants to export. Up to now, 7 export licenses to non-free trade countries have been given out by the Department of Energy in the United States. If you want to export shale gas, you have to prove to non-FTA countries, you have to prove vis-à-vis the administration that it is in the national interest of the United States. So in 7 cases, the Department of Energy came to the conclusion, yes, it is in the national interest of the United States. And those are quotas, those are quantities which are quite considerable. We're talking of about 95 billion cubic meters, which is more than a year, which is more than the annual consumption in Germany, and it's only a little bit less than the number 1 LNG exporter, Qatar, sends out exports in the world today. So it is already a substantial amount of gas that the US will export in the years to come. But that goes to Asia. Vast majority goes to Asia. In the moment, we have one advantage. The reserves are there. We have enough. It is summer. We don't need much gas. So for the time being, nobody feels pressures. But when the next winter comes, we in Europe will see whether we like it or not. And of course, we don't like it. We will see that there is this ongoing dependency on Russia. We can reduce this with more interconnectors. Günther Oettinger is talking with his colleagues about reverse flow. How to do that technically is still not fully solved, but it is in the discussion and it will work to a certain extent. But, and that's the main question also to our speakers, is there a concrete possibility in the next few years to reduce that dependency from Russia, which amounts in Europe to 30%, a bit more than 30%. In some parts of Europe, it's up to 100%. Will there be a substantial reduction, and does that come via shale gas? Last point, again, to this discussion in the US. We know that the Tea Party people say, we need the gas for ourselves. We want to be energy independent, and the less we export, the longer we can keep that energy independence. Chemical companies like Dow Jones, they say, well, we have now a competitive advantage. Our chemical industry, our industries in the whole who are energy intensive, they have an advantage to the whole world because of the cheap gas prices. In the moment we start to export, this drift between European, Asian prices on the one hand, American prices on the other hand, will somewhat vanish away, will be watered down. So Dow Chemical would ask the question, why are we depriving us of our competitive advantage? And there are similar voices in Congress. So the question is, if we look for shale gas in the United States, is that a reliable source? Is that a reliable political climate? Or is it possible that a next administration says, well, it is not in the interest of the United States to export. We want to keep our stuff by ourselves. So we are looking for reliable partners to foster energy security. Is US shale gas, under these circumstances, more reliable than pipeline gas from Russia? Just questions to ask, a bit provocative. Before Eric, as a representative of the European Commission, starts, it is my great pleasure to say again how grateful we are to do this workshop series together with two very distinguished institutions, that is the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where Sasha Havlicek is the CEO and Lord Weidenfeld is the founding president, and with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Mr. Blomeyer, who is the head of the Adenauer Foundation, sends his best regards. He couldn't make it today, but he has representatives here of the Adenauer Foundation. Sasha is here, and I would like to give the floor for Sasha to address you.
Thank you so much, Friedbert. I now realize I stand between you and this great expertise on this panel, which is a dangerous place to be sitting, because I salute you for all making it here, despite the transport problems. And I of course, can't add much to what Friedbert has said, but just a couple of words about why we're doing this and our perspective on this issue. I don't know if any of you know the Institute, but we are a sort of solutions-oriented think and do tank. And we have a tradition of working across sectors with academia, with policymakers, and with the private sector to try and figure out how interests can, as much as possible, be brought together to overlap to provide sustainable solutions to some of the big geostrategic and security challenges of our time. Our key areas of concern have ranged from these sorts of areas of European foreign policy to counterterrorism and counter-extremism, where we are probably most active in our work. Friedbert has said this is the second in a series of workshops that we've been invited to help organize, and we are very grateful for that. We've modified this event in view of events in Ukraine, quite obviously, because they warrant great attention. We're interested, of course, in energy flows from the perspective both of how they are shaped by and are shaping geopolitical developments. And so just from our perspective, I'd be very interested to hear from this group as we proceed through the presentations and discussion. A few things. As we know, the Ukrainian situation has bumped up the issue of European energy diversification higher on political agendas. But of course, that differs from country to country across Europe. I have to say, I think it's extraordinary that the Conservatives have started to big up Europe on energy. That's always an extraordinary thing to see when Britain starts getting enthusiastic about a European policy domain, then you know that something is afoot. So something really to watch there. There's no question that diversification, of course, now becomes more of a political priority than it has been to date. And that, I think, is an opportunity we need to be taking up quite quickly, quite rapidly. We've talked a little bit about the question of Eastern Med gas in the first session. We think that, again, Ukraine has sort of pushed up the political priorities around those sorts of supply issues, and looking forward to seeing how shale connects into that set of challenges today. I think it's, from a layperson's perspective, interesting that the shale revolution in the US has been regarded from Europe with a mix of, I'd say, sort of envy, critique, and fear to date. There's been very little discussion about the opportunity that it might present for Europe. Envy because, of course, it represents this extraordinary potential for independence that we don't see ourselves having at this point in time. It's an enormous economic boost and a comparable boost that puts us rather in a bad situation from a price perspective. Critique, obviously, because of all the fracking and environmental concerns. And I think the fear really emerges because of the sense that this will finally be the nail in the coffin for European geostrategy in the sense of American support. And in a way, this is the final pivot, if you like, away both from the Middle East and at the same time from Europe. And I think that the shale issue has been regarded primarily as a negative in terms of America's geostrategic engagement in Europe and in its wider neighborhood. The question now of whether that could be turned on its head, could the sort of traditional transatlantic partnership, could America's masters see the need for a geostrategic partnership with Europe in a way to push back the powers that are the Russian powers and so on? Could this actually be a rationale for re-engagement? I think that's a question that we are interested to raise here. And as Friedbert says, of course, this is a long-term one. The question of whether subsequent administrations in the US will see that as being of interest, let alone, of course, the private sector interest, I think will be another set of questions that we're very interested to hear more about from the experts. So I pass it over to you.
Well, if you allow me, thank you very much, Sasha. I would like to start our discussion with the introduction of Eric Mamer. Eric is a deputy head of cabinet for Günther Oettinger, the DG Energy. I've met him a few weeks ago in a discussion with Daniel Jürgen. And after that discussion, I said, well, you have to come to EUCERS. I do not say more to introduce yourself because everybody has your CV on its table. Why don't you just start, Eric?
Okay. Thank you very much, Friedbert. Thank you, Sasha, for inviting me to this event. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. As you will have seen from my CV, in fact, I'm not really an energy expert. I've been working in the field for roughly 2 years now. So don't expect from me any big technical presentations. I bring a sort of a fresh look to this in a way, not dissimilar to Sasha's point of view, I have to say, looking at it really from the international relations angle, from the political angle, from the European Commission's perspective. And what interested me in the question that was raised for this session today, is shale gas from the US an alternative? It is that initially I read it differently. I read words into it that were not there. I read into it, is cheap shale gas from the US an alternative to Gazprom gas tomorrow if Gazprom gas is suddenly cut off? That's immediately what sprang to my head. And then the second thought was, actually, a few months ago, we would have left off the whole dimension of Gazprom and cutting off gas flows tomorrow and simply focus on the cheap, on the economical. But now, clearly, the security of supply dimension has come to the fore. The urgency of the whole debate is no longer linked to the sort of statistics that we would be describing to people about the loss of share of industrial added value in Europe in favor of US reindustrialization. And it has moved to a much more, I'm not going to say life and death, but a much more uncomfortable, at least if you think of heating, uncomfortable debate about what can we do to make sure we have enough gas in Europe if things go badly wrong in Ukraine, more badly wrong than they have, and that we need immediate solutions. And I think, Friedbert, you've given the answer to the question in your introductory remarks, and indeed they are here in the paper that was given to us to prepare for this event. I think it's clear to everyone that shale gas from the US cannot replace Gazprom gas anytime soon, be it in terms of the volumes, be it in terms of the reliability of the deliveries, be it in terms of simply the ease with which the gas flows to Europe. So clearly that cannot be the question. Obviously, we have to think about this in a much more long-term perspective, medium to long-term perspective, and this is where the word, is it an alternative, N becomes important. And there indeed, yes, we believe that US LNG is part of a mix of solutions that the EU should be pushing for in the medium term, and this is what we keep saying to our American partners. Be it in terms of direct exports to Europe, which is something we would dearly like, but we don't believe is really feasible in the current context, or simply in terms of more US exports being available on world markets, which has the potential, at least at the margins, to influence offer of gas and therefore have some influence on prices and availability of LNG gas for Europe. I think that that's how we would look at it in the medium term in terms of what it is that we can realistically achieve. This assumes, of course, that there is no utter meltdown in Ukraine in geopolitical terms, because if that were to happen, then I'm sure that the whole debate would become a completely different one, and that even the Americans who say that this is all market-based, that they have no national gas company that can do anything, et cetera, might start considering some unconventional political solutions to try to help us. At least that is what one should hope. Nevertheless, the other question is whether we should rely on this sort of bailout, if I can call it that way, to solve our issues. We have American military presence. Do we need American energy presence to ensure the EU's sovereignty, independence, and well-being? And I think that the only answer that we can give to that is that in the medium term, we have to try to work through these issues ourselves. Obviously, we are never going to be completely energy independent. We are dependent on external energy for more than half of our consumption overall, 2/3 in the gas field, and Russia, by the way, is not only our main partner, our main source of gas, it's also our main source of oil, and it has been until recently, or possibly still is, our main source of coal. So this is not a partnership that you dissolve from one day to the next, even if you wanted to. And the whole issue is about how we can progressively change the balance for lots of reasons, one of which obviously is security of supply, another which is climate change, and another which is economic competitiveness. And there, the European Union is working very hard. In the short term, obviously, we are working on the action plan that the European Council has mandated us to draw up by June of this year on energy security, and which obviously has three dimensions. One which is how can you increase energy production in the European Union. The second is how can you diversify sources, and as we said, US LNG is definitely one subject to look into, one source to look into, but definitely not the only one. And then the third is reducing our energy consumption, and the whole area, very delicate area, but also possibly very promising area if we tackle it seriously, of energy efficiency. The second immediate priority and action, and I should have mentioned it first actually, is keeping contact, keeping channels open with Russia, with Ukraine, so as to avoid the problem. And indeed, my commissioner will be in Warsaw the day after tomorrow, to meet with Energy Minister Novak from the Russian Federation, Energy Minister Prodan from Ukraine, and this is where the EU has to show what it can do. We are there to mediate, help find solutions between Ukraine and Russia, within Ukraine as well, and between these two very important countries and ourselves, in a way. We are as much a subject as a mediator in this discussion, in terms of ensuring that at least the energy dimension of this issue, for example, the debt, the arrears that Naftogaz has vis-à-vis Gazprom, does not lead to serious issues of gas delivery to Europe. So that's the first dimension, keeping the dialogue open with what, after all, has been a very reliable partner until now, and still is, Russia, when it comes to energy, Ukraine, and making sure that the gas keeps going. Then this energy strategy that I was discussing, and then there is the whole issue of the 2030 perspective, the 2030 strategy that the European Union more long-term is working on, and which is there to help us find a new balance in our energy systems, indeed in our whole economic system, so as to be less dependent on energy, less energy intensive, and therefore reduce a little bit the degree to which these questions have to be treated every time there's a crisis as a matter of life and death. I think those are the main points that I would make as an introduction, and I'll be very, very happy to hear your views, because to be perfectly honest with you, I've come here looking as much for answers and insights as to give information. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. I would like to turn to Dr. Petra Dolata. She is, pardon? Why not? Any problems? No, I think we should ask. Ladies first. Petra, let me say a few words to Petra. She is with King since 2007 and will leave, and she's, as you know, research director at EUCERS. She will leave us, though, pretty soon, not because she's fed up with us, but because she got really a great appointment from Canada. She will become a full professor in Calgary, at the University of Calgary, with a wonderful assignment on energy history. And well, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Petra for her great engagement with EUCERS. Wish her all the best, and I hope that we will see you at one of our next workshops in Calgary, or even better in Banff, which is must be a wonderful place. So all the best for you, and thank you for everything. Petra, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And as you've heard, I might add a slightly different angle to these discussions that we had over the past weeks and looking towards the US, and that is actually both history and Canada. I think for some of us who look at the potential that, in a long-term perspective, LNG will have in international global trade, it is surprising that we don't hear more about Canada. Even more so if you recall that in March, the foreign minister of Canada actually made that point, that Canada, being an energy superpower, that's how they sell themselves in the world, would be able to help out Europe in these times. It was interesting to see that it was Angela Merkel actually who was first to point out that this might not necessarily a very viable option. And then Beard, the foreign minister, actually stressed that he was rather thinking about the Baltic states, for whom this might be an option. Now, I think to take a step back here, the important thing is, and this is what I'm always interested in, is when discussing these issues, they're not new, as you mentioned, they come up again and again when there's a crisis situation, is that we need to understand that this is a complex topic where markets and politics intersect. And I think this is exactly what we even see by this offer of Canada. Canada has a very vocal Ukrainian community. And so there is a reason, in addition to a very specific conservative foreign policy that we see at the moment, that Canada is actually very vocal in positioning itself currently with the crisis. So no wonder that seeing itself as energy superpower, having a business interest, because as I will outline, in contrast to the United States, the Canadian energy market is a lot more open and does not face any political hurdles such as the impossibility, really, to easily export oil and gas because of energy security considerations. That is not something that we have in Canada. But on top of that, there's a very political narrative involved here as well, because Canada's politicians need to present themselves as defending the Ukraine and the Baltic states. So this is one of the interesting things that we see here. Now, there are a couple of things that I would already raise here. One is the idea that why do we talk so much about gas? Well, on the one hand, it is, of course, the shale gas revolution. But I think, secondly, we have to realize that the climate change debate has brought gas to the forefront because it has become the cleaner fuel. You know, it's all relative and I won't go into this, but I think it's important to note that there is a reason why it is gas that becomes more and more interesting, with, of course, developments such as that it becomes more internationally traded. Secondly, there seems to be a reflex where we always focus on supply side responses, right? So we look at diversification, but as you've mentioned, you know, don't forget the demand side responses. And we know from the aftermath of the 1973 energy crisis, the most long-lasting changes were actually those that were pursued on the demand side. And so I think, you know, maybe in our discussions, we are also very quickly having this reflex in the way that we try and make sense of this crisis. Which brings me to this differentiation between short-term actionism. You know, we're not surprised by it's the same stories. I mean, surely in 2006 and 2009, we have heard similar things. What has changed, of course, is the shale gas revolution and the assumption that there's a lot of gas available out there in the international market. But, as we have heard, the United States actually has a lot of regulations against that, but also in terms of facilities. And so after having said that, Canada may be another country that we want to look towards too. The same limitations apply to Canada as well. We currently do not have a single functioning LNG export facility. What we do have is an import one in New Brunswick, and we do have currently, that's on the East Coast, we currently have 7 projects for LNG export terminals in Canada, 1 in Nova Scotia, that's East Coast as well, but all the remaining 6 West Coast, so it's Kitimat and others. There's, for example, Chinese involvement in those. As I mentioned, the Canadian energy market is actually fairly open. The problem is, first of all, even if they are constructed, you need to get oil and gas to these 2 coasts. And we currently have a very acrimonious debate within Canada. So not only Keystone is a big issue, but we also have the questions about constructing any pipelines to the West Coast, you know, because there are very heavy regulatory sort of limitations to it, and also because a lot of Indigenous communities are actually affected. That's something that you always need to remember for Canada, particularly in the West. So there is, for Canada, you know, it might be a long-term alternative, certainly never to replace, and I think that's where we can all agree. But we do know that Canada has quite an interest to diversify away, because they also need to diversify away from their dependence on the United States. Currently, all the oil and gas goes to the United States. And so that is A, never good for an economy, and B, the Canadians get very worried about the way that the US now becomes in itself a very important producer. So we can see that the Canadians are actually interested in coming to Europe and telling us about how this is an alternative. I take the argument that we hear that you always get a higher price in Asia than in European markets, but I think we still don't know as well what happens if Australia really becomes that big LNG provider. Does that close some of the Asian markets, for example, and make the European market more interesting? Secondly, what happens if China pursues its shale gas projects? So we all have this assumption that China is a market that we can all reckon with over the next 10, 20 years. But I think, there might be some arguments, I generally agree with what you say, but there might be some arguments that do at least give a sort of a business argument to also looking towards Europe. I know that the Canadian government has run a couple of, conferences, for example, in Italy with the Italian Energy Ministry to talk about the possibility of Canadian gas to be shipped to Europe. So I think, do remember that the United States is a very special case. I won't go into this in any detail, but there are many political reasons why we cannot expect simply that the United States will be happy to supply Europe with oil and gas. Because there is a very stable energy security discourse since the 1970s that has brought about a regulatory regime that until today makes it very difficult to just export oil and gas from the United States. So Canada might be a possibility, but I think most of it will be geared towards Asia. The last point, maybe in favor of Europe, is CETA. So this is something that for the Canadians, it was very, very important to have that comprehensive agreement, and it includes some of energy-related articles. So maybe that would help sort of a view towards Europe. But generally, I agree with what you've heard here. If at all, this is a very long-term perspective. It certainly won't replace the gas that we have. And maybe some of the lessons that we have to learn from this is to not always have that immediate reflex when we have these crises, and also never forget about the demand side and think about where we can do something there. So I'll leave it at that. I'm more than happy to answer and engage with the discussion that will follow.
Thank you, Petra, and I think everybody could already feel how enthusiastic you are about Canada, and almost feel like a Canadian right now, and that's great, and I'm sure you will have a great time and hope for future cooperation. I would like to turn to Henning Gloystein, a senior correspondent, head of European power, gas and coal with Reuters News. And your first time here?
Yes, it's been a while since I've been in a university, so thanks for the invite. I actually have a couple of slides, and I'm not going to say anything much new. I'm quite glad, because normally my job is to ask questions rather than provide answers. And I'm quite glad to see that some of the visualizations that you'll see in a minute are actually much in line to what you've heard in the last 10 minutes. So if we go directly to the next slide, as you've heard in the last couple of minutes, there's a lot of hope that US LNG will solve a lot of questions here in Europe. So let me visualize sort of what the trading community and what investors and politicians see in this matter. So A, is it realistic? If so, when? And if so, where could it go? In the next slide, you can already see, is it realistic right now? The answer is probably not. I don't know whether you can see that at the back there, but basically what you have there is the UK spot gas price, currently around anywhere between 55 and 60 pence per therm. And if you currently want to attract LNG in the spot market to Europe, you'll have to double that price to about 120 pence per therm. The last time we had that here in Britain is pretty exactly a year ago, when it was very cold for very long, and we almost ran out of gas storage here in Britain. At that point, Qatar decided to send quite a lot of LNG back to Europe instead of its main customers in Asia. And what happened, or as a result, the trigger for those reshipments was that price spike you see earlier in that chart. So that is the reality. If we want LNG cargoes from Qatar right now, you would have to double the gas price here. If we go to the next slide, could American shale gas come here? Yeah, of course it could. You see the lower chart there is US Henry Hub gas prices. They're anywhere between $4 and $5 per MMBTU. The upper price is the UK gas price. Now, the problem is if you add liquefaction fees from the future LNG projects in the United States, if you add shipping, and the basic fee from companies like Cheniere, who are hoping to export very soon, you pretty much immediately arrive at the current European spot gas price. So A, it means US shale gas would not make European gas any cheaper at all, and B, you would also find that probably at some point soon it would start struggling to compete with Russian gas prices. Problem being is the US gas curve is in a situation that's called contango, which means that it's getting more expensive as we go further out in time due to the export outlook. European gas, by contrast, is actually in a situation that's called backwardation, which means it's getting cheaper further out. And that is putting US gas to Europe under pressure. So, and if we look at the next situation, I apologize, that's really hard to see, but it's been mentioned before. If you're an American exporter, why would you sell to Europe if you can make twice as much money if you can sell that same gas to, let's say, Japan, South Korea, but also Latin America, where gas prices are also twice as high as they are here? So that is one to keep in mind. It is an open market in the United States for the time being, and it would take a lot of political disruption, it's been mentioned a bit earlier, to force American companies to send to Europe rather than to Asia. If you look at the next slide then is, well, can it ever come? Yes, it can. It's also been mentioned a little bit before. Vast amounts of new projects are coming to market in the next 5 to 10 years. Australia's been mentioned. They've got huge export project plans. I was in Mozambique the other week. They have vast amounts of gas to sell there. There's a lot to be done before they can sell it, but it is there. Tanzania is there. The Eastern Mediterranean has a lot of gas coming up, and obviously North America as well. That in itself should bring Asian gas prices down somewhat in the next couple of years. If China decides to go down the shale route, you have another bearish impact. And that might actually make Europe more attractive suddenly. These things can change. Asian gas prices weren't always twice as much as they were in Europe. Fukushima had a lot to do with that, but also the outright demand boom in Eastern Asia. The next factor is oil. Oil prices, there are a lot of people who say oil prices of $70, $80, maybe even a bit low, could well be possible. If that happens, you can almost guarantee that gas and coal prices and whatever else will go down as well. And to briefly address where could it go, within Europe, it's also been mentioned the Baltic states look quite well positioned to take some of the North American LNG. So if you go to the next slide there again, this is something that's, I think, been overlooked a little bit. The top pie chart there is Polish gas supplies in 2009. 90% Russian, 10% other. If you look at last year, you already had about a third from other, and the other basically being re-exports from Germany, but it gives you an alternative of supply. And you might have, as of next year, they are building an LNG terminal. You could, in theory, get a situation where almost 2/3 of Polish gas is non-Russian. It could be a bit of shale in the next couple of years, but there could be some LNG imports from Qatar, and at some point in the next couple of years, North America could come in as well. You see Cheniere from Louisiana at every single Baltic Energy Conference, and there is a reason for this. So I find this quite remarkable. Poland is right on its way in the last 4 or 5 years from being completely energy reliant on Russia to actually being fairly independent from Russian supplies. And if you go to the next slide, this is overall a summary of pretty much what you've heard in the last half hour. We have calculated that the total amount that Europe could probably wean itself or reduce Russian gas supplies is about 45 to 50 BCM, which accounts to about a quarter of Russian supply. And also, as been mentioned before, the biggest chunk of that is actually demand destruction through energy efficiency increases. It always gets overlooked for some reason. Journalists don't like it. It doesn't sound very sexy, and it's quite complicated. Double glazing, it's all very, non-big scale, but it works. Azerbaijan is coming to market within this decade. They're sending 16 BCM to Europe, 6 to Turkey, 10 to the European Union. I believe Sokar is actually in the room. New Baltic LNG, that's essentially North American gas. Romania, also often overlooked. They've got the Black Sea, they've got some onshore gas, and then the smallest one there is the Eastern Mediterranean. Some ifs and buts about that, still mainly political, but they've got a lot of gas. So if we go to the conclusions in the next set, conclusion 1, US shale gas is no short-term fix for Europe. It's been mentioned. And first exports anyway aren't expected in the next, well, months. It's a year or two early, at least, and most of that's been contracted to Asia already. And the second conclusion, US gas would actually also struggle to make money in Europe, and it would actually not be cheaper than Russian gas. And there's also the American perspective as why on earth would you sell to us if you can make twice as much elsewhere. But in conclusion 3, not all is lost. US shale gas could help some European long-term supply issues. The Baltic states in particular look quite well placed for this. And I'm glad to have mentioned it. Also, watch out for Canada. It is overlooked. There's a lot of gas there. There's an East Coast LNG terminal planned. It's, in global terms, it's not very far to, especially again, the Baltics. And the long-term price outlook for LNG could actually favor some re-exports to Europe. So this is also what the European Commission said a bit earlier. Even if all that American gas doesn't directly go to Europe, by ripple effect, if gas gets cheaper, other LNG exporters, be it Nigeria, Algeria, Qatar, could actually decide sending gas to Europe instead of Latin America and Asia. So those were the visualizations of what's been asked before or mentioned before, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Much Canadian lobby. No, just kidding. Frank Umbach, I have put Frank at the end of the list because I know that he can combine his initial statement with comments already. And just to note, Frank, who is now our Associate Director from the first minute of this institute, will follow Petra as our Research Director. Frank, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me say at the beginning, I don't want to portray a very different picture from my other speakers before, but maybe highlight some new facts or underline what my colleagues have already stated. The question of US LNG exports is of course not new. It's around since 3-4 years, since the shale gas revolution. The US became already the world's largest gas producer in 2010, and then in 2012 again will become a net LNG exporter in 2016 when the first LNG terminal will be open. And in 2021, it's expected to become then an overall net exporter of natural gas. In response to the demands of reducing or diversifying Europe's gas imports, it's also necessary to mention, maybe in contrast to some of the political debates and TV debates maybe in particular, that there is no silver bullet solution in terms that you have one energy source, one option, whether it's an import option or energy efficiency or whatever you have, which will really solve the problem. It can only be a mix of various measures in order to diversify the European gas imports. But in contrast to the last big Russian-Ukrainian gas conflict in 2009, the situation today is totally different. At that time, we had hardly any alternative gas import options available. That's very, very different. And if you have been here in one of those workshops we did over the last year with the new pipeline option of the Sasha corridor, what we heard also with Canada and a lot of others are highlighting there are a lot of different import options available. And in addition to that diversity of import option, there's another factor which was quite different to 2009, and that is that the gas demand of Europe is stagnating. Yeah, quite contrary to the previous years and forecasts. If you just take the IEA publication of the World Energy Outlook, let's say of around 2009, you will find forecasted import demand rising from approximately 300 billion cubic meters per year to more than 500 billion cubic meters a year by the year 2035. If you look to the newest publications, and I think the Commission is even more skeptical in this respect, the IEA projections went down to approximately 450 BCM. Yeah, and it's forecasting in its latest World Energy Outlook that the gas demand of Europe is stagnating. The level of 2010 is stagnating at least until the year 2020. And even by the year 2035, it may not rise. Very much dependent on the transport sector. Will it shift from oil to gas, including also the shipping industry or not? But at least in the midterm perspective, it's stagnating. Also, that affects, of course, the European gas market in terms of the prices you indicated. We see that very dramatically in Germany, for example. Also very much influenced also by the flooding of cheap US coal exports to Europe, quite contrary to our climate policies. In respect, again, to the US LNG exports, the question became already politically debated when the Visegrad countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, even before the Ukrainian conflict, were appealing to the US that the US government should facilitating US LNG export. And these calls have been repeated in the spring of this year. What is overlooked in this kind of discussion, and maybe also in Washington to some extent, is that there is an opportunity and there is even a need for making a basic major decision in this direction, because many of the Gazprom gas supply contracts will expire with the European countries in the next 2 to 3 years. So even in this respect, there is some kind of pressure on the decision makers on focusing on the various options. And of course, as Petra was saying, there is...
May I just interrupt with one question? We just heard from Henning how much the alternatives of additional gas from additional sources could make a difference until 2020.
Right.
But when you take into consideration this quite dramatic decrease of home production in the EU, I wonder whether these additional sources that you have mentioned will just make up for the loss in home production, or which would mean the share would not be the Russian share at the end would not be reduced, or is that really a reduction of the share of the Russian energy?
I wanted to come a little bit later to that question, but just making the point, if you look to the Commission's forecasts of our own European shale gas resources, that always made the statement that if we would use Europe's own shale gas resources, that can compensate the loss of the depleting fields. I would be a little bit even more optimistic, but then coming back to the that's beyond the other various import options you have. I mentioned Petra's Canadian LNG exports. If you look to the numbers, officially also stated by the Canadian government, so after 2017 might be a little bit early and probably one or 2 years later, around 40 BCM, more than 40 BCM of exports becoming available, regardless of the question whether that will go to Europe or rather to Asia. But it will come at least to the global gas markets. Yeah? And that will increase, of course, the pressure also on the prices at a time when also a large additional volumes become available also from a number of other countries such as Australia, which has been mentioned. Let's take a short view on the US LNG export. US LNG export need 2 approvals. One approval by the Department of Energy to sell gas overseas. That is a decision and an approval process which is very much debated at the moment. because that decision can be facilitated and also fastened in a certain way. The second approval is the more lengthy and the more complicating one, and in this respect I'm not so optimistic, and that's made by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is overlooking and controlling whether the projects meet environmental, safety and other regulations. In this respect, I'm not so optimistic that this process will be fastened. If we are looking to the present situation, the DOE, also the Department of Energy process, has approved 6 export projects, and the seventh one, which is conditional on a variety of issues. Out of approximately more than 28 projects. If you look to the total volumes which would theoretically become available, that's almost more than 300 billion cubic meters, the entire import volumes of Europe. Of course, the forecast is that by around 2020, the US will export between 40 to 80 BCM, 10 to 20 BCM will go to Europe. But that was the basic political debate already before the Ukrainian conflict. And now the question also in the Congress is whether those exports, particularly to Europe, will not be fastened in a variety of ways. And in terms of the cost differences, which is of course one of the other challenges, with Asian gas prices 50% higher than in Europe, of course also the government has instruments available which could be used, tax regulatory regime which could make exports to Europe also financially more attractive. Yeah? So I would not totally disclose that kind of options, but none of the present 6 projects, with the exception of the Crimea project, has finalized its financing, which is also still a problem for the projects, regardless of the approval processes. There are some congressional initiatives, as I said, to speed up those LNG exports to Europe in light of the conflict with Russia. The Obama government has made clear that it's looking more to the geopolitical side of the approval process on the side of the Department of Energy, but it's not looking on the more lengthy and complicated approval process of the Federal Commission. Perspectives on Europe's side, as I said, on one hand, there's an overall gas import dependency still rising, but not so much as it was predicted some years ago. The US LNG exports, even if you would be very optimistic, will not, at least not immediately, solve the problem. But even if smaller volumes would become available after 2016, it would send a clear signal that the European and global gas markets are changing, with much greater supply options and volumes coming from new producers and exporters around the globe, and that would have a market and a price impact even more than the volumes would suggest. What is more important, I think, than the question of US LNG exports alone is the question whether we use our own domestic shale gas resources. And you have referred to the very often overlooked benefits which we try to portray already in the report in 2011. Very few remarks on Ukraine. Ukraine, which is very much overlooked in those debates we have at the moment, had, even under Yanukovych, a rather successful gas diversification strategy implemented since 2011. It has reduced Russian gas imports from 40 BCM in 2011 to 27 billion cubic meters, even under Yanukovych, which is very often overlooked. And if you look to the diversification strategies, there are a lot of issues which can be used also on our side and which is actually being discussed, including energy efficiency measures. on the US side as well as on our side, also in the German Foreign Ministry, in supporting the forthcoming and much needed energy reforms on the side of Ukraine and diversifying its gas imports as well as in reducing its overall energy demand. However, Ukraine was also at the forefront of the European shale gas projects. It has two larger projects, one in its eastern region, led by Shell, and in its western region by Chevron. Of course, given the political situation at the moment, it doesn't seem very, doesn't look very promising for the project of Shell in its eastern regions. But the Chevron project will definitely become ever more important, and that has to do that one important import diversification option of Ukraine has also more or less disappeared at the moment, and that is its oil and gas projects in the Black Sea, which were very near to Crimea. And there will be certainly legal battles between Russia and Ukraine in respect to the offshore energy resources in the years to come. What is also overlooked on the European side, that's the last point I will make, is the impacts it will have on Russia. As I mentioned, Ukraine has already reduced significantly its gas imports from Russia during the last years. Ukraine was one, after Germany, one of the most important gas markets for Gazprom. Gazprom had to pay, or Ukraine had to pay prices on gas imports from Russia which were ridiculous, which had nothing to do with any kind of market prices. The market price Ukraine had to pay were higher than those Western Europe's had to pay, despite the fact that the transport way is much longer. So normally you would expect that the Ukrainian import price from Russia would be approximately 70 to 80 US dollars less per 1,000 cubic meters than Germany or the Netherlands would have to pay. And in this respect, as in one of the major questions for me and certainly for the Commission in the months ahead will be the fate of South Stream. South Stream is the most expensive gas import option at all. And that's not really being discussed, I think, in Europe, not to speak about in those countries which have signed new gas contracts with Russia, such as Bulgaria or Serbia. Why? Because Russia needs to build a very, very expensive new infrastructure on its own territory, which is called its own Southern Corridor, to connect new pipelines from its gas fields by circumventing Ukraine down to on its own territory, where the undersea pipeline will start through the Black Sea. And the overall cost of this new infrastructure had been increased by more than 50% last December to more than 21 billion US dollars, which are not covered in any official cost calculation of the South Stream project. But it's clear that those costs need to be covered somehow in the gas contracts. And that's one of the reasons, in addition, that its new gas fields and production costs are much, much higher in Russia than the old depleting fields where it can get the gas from at the moment. Therefore, that's the reason why I called the South Stream option the most expensive gas import option at a time when Europe and also the Commission officially becomes ever more interested in reducing the gas prices in competition with US gas prices, because US gas prices in comparison with the European one are 3 times less, which is affecting our overall economic competitiveness. But in addition, that brings Ukraine into the game. When Russia signs a new gas contract with Ukraine, when Ukraine was returning to the Russian orbit in last December, Russia reduced tremendously the gas prices for Ukraine by 40%. So from that time, the question was more or less on the table, what's the economic rationale then for South Stream and Gazprom? for justifying the projects when Ukraine would return to the orbit, because it was a geopolitical project from the very beginning, as Russian experts always admit. But even at that time, in December, Russian experts were arguing, well, South Stream will be built because of geopolitical reason. And the geopolitical reason is, and that needs to be debated on the Commission side in the forthcoming months, is that it was always designed by circumventing Ukraine, which would result in a situation where Russian exports to Europe through Ukraine will constantly be reduced. And that will have two effects. On one, economically, it means that Ukraine wouldn't earn so much money from the transit fees. The second result is even more important. In its future gas negotiations with Russia, Ukraine would not have the same kind of leverage as it would have before. And given the new situation, when Europe and the United States has promised to support Ukraine politically, economically, and particularly in respect to its energy reforms, if the Commission and the member states would agree with the South Stream project, it would not only mean becoming dependent on the most expensive gas import option, it would mean also it would increase Europe's dependency much more when other options are available and all other import options are much cheaper because of the shorter transport ways. And it would mean at the end, as Ukrainians were arguing, and I think that there is a point, if we would agree to that, then it would be then Europe would sell the kind of rope on which the Russian would use to hang Ukraine in the future, because it would tremendously increase the pressure on Ukraine. And this geopolitical dimension is not being debated so far in the public. We debate about the unbundling processes, the legal issues, which is officially the agenda of the joint working group between Russia and the Commission setting up last January, now being postponed for obvious reasons. But these geopolitical dimensions will become more to the forefront and needs to be debated on our side how we can justify such a project in terms when we promise Ukraine to help to diversifying its gas imports and to reduce its dependence on Russia. And I stop here.
Thank you, Frank, and I will now turn, coming to an end shortly with the presentations, but we have two research associates who have dealt with that subject. Jan-Justus Andreas is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Fellow at EUCERS, and he's just now preparing a study on the geopolitical and economic implications of the US drive towards energy independence. By the way, I would like to announce that the Konrad Adenauer Foundation has just granted a second fellowship to EUCERS. So we're happy. Thank you to the representatives of the Adenauer Foundation for that ongoing and even deepening support of EUCERS. Jan-Justus, please.
Thank you very much. Now, as a lot has already been said, that probably most of the LNG from the North American continent will not actually reach Europe, and I would completely agree with that, in fact. I would just like to have a look at the actual developments that we can see in the US currently and probably in the near future regarding the shale revolution. So what we have seen over the past years and will continue to see is a rising demand in the US for natural gas. This is, of course, primarily in the electricity sector, where over the past 10 years, the amount of natural gas output has actually almost doubled. So we will probably continue to see this trend due to the fact that several coal plants are to retire based on the emission policy grounds, and those are expected to be replaced through natural gas. Now, another big aspect, which has already also been mentioned for the increasing in demand, is the industry side of things, and that means primarily petrochemicals as well as the fertilizer industry, but also other electricity-intensive industries which are returning to the US or expanding their businesses in the US. So the Federal Reserve is actually expecting an almost 5% increase in industrial production output by 2035 compared to the 2011 levels, solely due to lower gas prices. But while we see this increase in demand, from the supply side, by the time that we will actually see large-scale LNG entering the global market, so by the end of the decade, we will probably most likely have moved beyond the peak of the shale gas output in the US. Some say the US has already actually surpassed that peak. This is due to the fact that of the 5 big plays of shale gas in the US, which constitute about 80% of total shale gas output, only one is actually currently increasing its output, with the other 4 stagnating or in decline. So by 2020, we will probably be reducing or at least stagnating the domestic natural gas output of the US while having to deal with a far stronger demand side within the US. So these two things will obviously lead to an increase in prices domestically. So we won't probably see a return to the former price levels of $3 per million BTU, and we'll probably also not be able to maintain the current price levels of around $4, but we will go up towards the $6. And as Mr. Gloystein has actually pointed out earlier, we need LNG trade is very expensive. So by having higher domestic prices, this will of course affect the LNG trade tremendously. At the same time, high prices are actually much liked by the industry itself, which had severe losses over the past years due to the plummeting prices. But again, as also has been mentioned from the manufacturer's side, of higher gas prices are not desirable because it could just reverse all the economic effects that we have seen so far. And just to stress that point, if all of the approved LNG terminals by the Department of Energy will be accepted, we will see an export of 13 billion cubic feet per day by 2020, which will constitute, with the contemporary expectations of the production, about 20% of total US natural gas output. And so the EIA is actually expecting that between 2013 and 2020, the natural gas price will rise by 32%. And could actually double by the time we reach 2030. At the same time, if the economy is continuously strengthened by the shale gas revolution, the IHS is actually looking or saying that the US GDP over the entire period between 2008 and 2035 will be developing or increasing by 3.5% on average, solely due to the shale gas revolution. So combining this then again with the decrease in imports of energy, we will probably also see an appreciating dollar, which will of course also have tremendous effects for general US exports. And now coming back as a last point basically to why I think that very little of North American LNG will actually reach the European market. There's of course also a strategic side to things. And I'm looking at Japan here, which had the unfortunate event of reaching a $20 or above $20 spot price earlier this year for its natural gas. This of course has to be seen in light with the Fukushima disaster and the increasing dependence of Japan on energy imports. And when we look at where these imports are primarily coming from, we see that most or the bulk of Japan's fossil fuel imports are actually coming from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And all these tankers have to transit through the Malacca Straits, through the Southeast China Sea. And I'm afraid this could probably in the next years, if we see an escalation, for example, in the island dispute with China, become Japan's Ukraine. And so they, of course, are also looking to the east, looking to North America, not just for natural gas, but also for crude oil exports in case the US decides to lift the export ban in that respect. So finally, from my perspective, very little LNG will probably reach the European market, maybe for the Balkans. But as also has been said, Europe might not even need North American natural gas if we look to other actors such as Algeria, Nigeria, which now are also, of course, always expanding their LNG export terminals. Those might enter the European market, especially also considering Asian competition with Australia and Mozambique coming up in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan-Justus. And I turn, last but not least, to Maximilian Kuhn, who has started from the very beginning to work here with EUCERS. Meanwhile, he has finished his PhD with a fascinating work on Iranian energy scenarios for Free University in Berlin. and is now also with the European Commission as a scientific support officer, Joint Research Center in the Netherlands. Max, please. It's always difficult to speak at the end, but perhaps you can concentrate on a few issues that we haven't touched yet.
Thanks a lot, Friedbert, and thanks a lot for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, but I have to say a small disclaimer that I'm going to speak on my own behalf and not on behalf of the Commission, as usual. I think to sum up the talk and to say what was this about, for me, the lesson learned is building infrastructure is always very difficult and costly, and it takes a long time. So the relationship we have built with Russia is over 50 years long, and it lasted through various political crises. So, and if you look into the Ukraine crisis, it started 5 years ago, and now the energy situation is, as it was highlighted by Frank and others, is even better than in 2008. And but in the end, nevertheless, dependencies are everywhere, and I think it's very important to stress that it's not only in gas, but if you talk in industry, you talk about molecules, and it's all about different type of molecules, especially if you also talk about US shale revolution. So it's more beyond the gas. It's liquids, it's the oil, it's all the natural gas liquids, the LPGs, everything which is being exported. But as it has been said, there's limitation to US exports. So oil is not allowed to be exported from the US. Gas is only allowed to be exported with certain FTA approval and the FRAC approval. And then refined products are allowed freely to be exported, whereas natural gas liquids can be exported under some circumstances. It depends on how they come out of the well. So there's really, it's not a free market approach from the US because it's very regulated on energy exports. And this is, as Justus said, it has its reasons in its own internal energy policy and also in its strategy to use and foster the energy independence it gained. So there's a lot of vested interest in the US about the production of shale oil and shale gas. So in the end, I want to also stress something about the molecule soup, saying about the oil and the refined products. European refineries are very dependent on Russian naphtha, and the naphtha price diverged from the gas price in the US. So the European refineries really suffer, and I think here in the UK you also had just a recent event with the refinery which went bankrupt. Yes. So the point is, what I wanted to stress is that the refineries in Europe have a very delicate situation, and they are also very dependent on the Russian naphtha, which is a certain type of crude, and it cannot be balanced against other crudes as easily because it depends on the type of crude, how heavy it is, how sweet, how sour it is. So they cannot really adjust quickly their refinery specifications. So this is also a very important aspect when it comes to energy security from one point of view. And in this situation, the European Commission also has a very delicate situation where it has to find a position between the market approach and the political one. Because when we look at LNG, the Europe sees a lot of LNG regasifications, seeing LNG coming to Europe, being unloaded and uploaded again to be sent away to the Asian or other markets. So this is happening very extensively in the last years, which is, first of all, undermines the fact that the European gas market has some incremental problems. And the other thing is, it underlines the fact that the gas price is too cheap in Europe. So the exporters, the markets, they rather focus on other areas. And the last point I wanted to say is, geopolitically, if you look at the crisis from 2009 to now 2014, the question is what has changed and what is actually the political reasoning to react so harshly now to this situation. also, we have more interconnectors. Just yesterday, Ukraine and Slovakia signed an agreement for reverse flows. Also there's the market approach is not clear because you can just use the pipeline capacity to re-export or to bring the gas into Ukraine again. But virtually, you could export even more to the Ukraine, but then you have market restrictions to that, and these needs to be overcome from a political point of view. And this is something where the European Commission probably has to step in. So for me, let's say the situation is very delicate, but the good thing is we're in summer now. We have a lot of months to go until winter. Our gas storage are more or less filled. So the situation is better now than in autumn or in winter. So it gives a lot of time to solve the situation with the Russians. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I think we got comprehensive picture by these great presentations. Thank you all the speakers, and the floor is to you. It's your floor. Whoever wants to raise questions, comments. Please go ahead. If you would be so kind to introduce you, because not everybody knows you.
Hello, my name is Peter Kuhn and I'm from the Economist Intelligence Unit. I've heard a lot about the US LNG export limitations, but what about the potential European import limitations to actually absorb LNG from elsewhere? I know that Europe's LNG import capacity is heavily underutilised because the demand isn't there. But at the same time, more than half of Europe's LNG import capacity is in the UK and Spain. Assuming that the US could export LNG to Europe, if it goes to Western Europe, how would that be absorbed through the system to get to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe that would need that gas to ease their reliance on gas supply from Russia? I know that the Baltic states, in Lithuania, they're building an offshore terminal. Poland is building an onshore terminal. But for other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, how would the infrastructure system, is it able to support the flow of gas once it's regasified from Western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe?
Thank you. We're collecting a few. Joanna, please. Joanna and then Benny. It's here.
Thank you. My question's to Mr. Mamer.
Also, please, if you would be so kind to
my name's
introduce.
Joanna Hansen, and I'm a senior visiting fellow at London School of Economics. Mr. Mamer, you mentioned the 2030 energy strategy. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about what effect the Ukrainian crisis is having now on the development of this strategy? The European Council looked at it in March when the crisis was coming to a head and no firm conclusions were reached. And as we know, it also includes aspects related to the Aviation Directive and ETS, which Russia and the USA have lobbied heavily against. Could you tell us a bit more about what's going on? Thank you very much.
We collect a few others. Benny, here. Here, Benny.
Benny Peiser from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. I mean, part of this problem is entirely self-made because over the last 10, 15 years, the key priority of the EU was climate change and climate change emissions targets and so on. And so therefore, all the kind of cheap energy had to be basically phased out or put a cap on, and a lot of the effort was going into renewables and gas. The question I have is the penny finally dropping, that there is simply no solution to the self-made energy crisis if you prioritize CO2 targets and thereby essentially negate any evolution of cheap energy in Europe. You heard the Polish Prime Minister a few days ago saying that Europe needed an energy union and coal needed to be rehabilitated. We have a lot of coal imports. There is a booming export of coal around the world. Coal is cheap. Europe is importing lots of coal. Are we going to see a shift in priorities in Brussels on what is actually the key priority in terms of energy policy?
Here. First.
Thank you. Shabir Razvi from International Finance Solutions Associates in London. Yes, I agree that it is a geopolitical issue rather than the pure supply and demand and pricing and so on. So in that context, with the current developments that Russia is negotiating with China to supply 30-year energy, plus also the relationship that's developing with Iran on a $20 billion transaction, which is almost coming to fruition, how will all these aspects really affect us in Europe as our economies are really going through quite a disastrous last 5 years and are quite fragile? If you look at the Mediterranean countries from Greece to Portugal, if they were a failed state in Africa or Asia, perhaps these would have been defined as failed states, and plus also in Western Europe. So these geopolitical issues, how would they impinge on the economic growth in Europe?
Last question in this first round. Please, this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Kokatz. I'm from Queen Mary University of London. I have, if I may, two questions about the EU. Firstly, considering Europe's aspirations to become a green energy fueled economy by 2050, how long would the EU would be likely to import US LNG, considering it has these aspirations? Would it be just a temporary fix towards building towards 2050, or would it be considered more of a long-term import past 2050? And then if I may, the second question regarding the South Stream project. Are there any new developments considering the problem the Russians have with the third energy package, speaking of ownership unbundling and South Stream? Because I believe about 4 months ago, one of the Russian representatives for the EU spoke that the EU should adapt its legislation to meet Russia's aspirations to build South Stream instead of vice versa. Thank you.
I would like to make one comment, perhaps because perhaps a little bit as an advocatus diaboli, because there is no real Russian voice here. And somebody from Russia. Well, is there somebody from? Well, but I would like to come back to one point from the Russian perspective. Energy security is as important as for us in Europe, in the EU countries. For us, it is supply security. For the Russians, it's demand security. So now, I know it's not popular in the moment to jump into the role of a Russian, but if I were a Russian energy politician and have to make, or a businessman, have to make long-term decisions on new fields, on pipelines, how would this sound in my ears if the whole European community now talks about diversification, substituting Russian energy supplies? Angela Merkel used the term and said a few days ago, we have to re-examine our whole energy policy towards Russia. Of course, you could say Russia should behave differently and all that problems would not arise. But I just would like you to jump for a minute into the role of the Russians, seeing this development. Perhaps that's also a point for Sasha. And also, let me make one other point. For the Germans, at least, I know that's not true for whole Europe. The partnership, the energy partnership with Russia, the gas partnership, has been a very reliable and very positive one over almost 5 decades now. The Germans would say the gas for oil, the gas for pipes, or pipes for gas contract that the Germans and the Russians executed since the 70s has been a stabilizing factor in Europe. It has contributed to overcoming the Cold War. So from the German perspective, from big companies in Germany, this was a reliable partner over the decades. Is there anybody of these alternatives more reliable, cheaper? And if so, we heard there are pressures for the Russians, and that I think is absolutely positive, that there is competition. But how much is the leeway of the Russians to go down with their prices to keep their position? In other words, is it only energy independence that counts? Or is it not, I learned this in school, interdependence between nations make peace and stability, not independence from other nations. So do we perhaps undervalue the achievement of the last decades of having a deep interdependence with Russia? I told you I'm advocatus diaboli, at least to a certain extent. Sasha, you want to?
I just wanted to add two very, very short questions to this point you're making on Russia, because we've talked a little bit about the diversification that's already been underway, and in Eastern Europe, of course, where the markets were totally dependent on Russian supply. Could you give us a sense of the cost to date of that diversification for Russia in sort of aggregate terms? That would be interesting to know. For Russia.
For Russia.
I mean, what have they lost so far?
Yeah.
And what is that trajectory looking like for them, even prior, of course, to this crisis? How has that been looking from their end? And the second question is really regarding this geostrategic point. Are we in the end starting to see a sort of European East-West divide, a sort of old Europe, new Europe divide on the ways in which diversification will take place, will be driven? And in that context, is there going to be a sort of new Europe, America potential, North America potential there that perhaps old Europe isn't seeing the need for?
Because we have limited time, I would ask other discussions and questions to be raised right now. Then we have a final round of speakers. So if there are any other comments, or please, Moses.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Moses. I'm a research assistant.
Oh, just wait a second.
I'm a PhD candidate in war study and defense. Looking at the perspective of this energy dynamic, I just want to make two comments. Within the national level, which is the perspective of the UK, compared to the global level, the European aspirations. If you look at the energy dynamic, the energy market is nowhere at the moment. You can't say the energy market is in Asia, is in Europe, or it's in Africa, or it's in North America. Why? Because a lot of the production coming upstream can't find a market because of shale gas. And a lot of these countries, like Angola, Equatorial Guinea, their LNG is floating on the sea on a spot price. And if you talk of diversification, the EU doesn't have enough storage capacity to capture this energy. So it's just floating there. The highest bidder get the energy. Then if you talk of relying on America exports, it's going to be like you are entering an option house whereby the highest bidder get the price. Last month, there was a conference of the LNG prospect for the UK held in the Exchange Yard in the City of London, and all the 5 licensees from the United States, the chief executive of this company, came, and I was able to have a word with them. None of them is even interested in exporting to Europe because of the price differentiation with Asia. So that is a key factor. So it's not going to be like you're going to have a dinner with the Yankees very soon. Then, secondly, if you look at the domestic production and the consumption in the UK, let's start from the national level. We produced 45 BCM in 2012. That is the UK. we consume 78 BCM. And if you subtotal the export aspiration of shale gas for the United States, is half the UK consumption. So that is a non-starter also. And if you look at the supply curve of the shale gas revolution, it's going to peak by 2030, and the export potential is not going to come to Europe. So my question is going to be to Mr. Eric. We have 7 regulatory authorities in the UK, and I can read the white paper, some of the regulatory authority for you, from the law firm advising the Department of Energy. Environmental consent, mining waste permit, regulatory. A license to extract water, regulatory. Groundwater activity permit, regulatory. Radioactive substances activity permit, regulatory. Assistance and approval of chemical use for hydraulic fracking, regulatory. And on top of that, the EU has speculated another documents that have to come into effect by July this year for consideration for a European regulatory activity of shale gas fracking. Yes, it has been circulated that national government have to consider it because the experience in Poland about the environmental and the green coming together to campaign against shale gas is so great. So my question to Eric is that when we have these several regulatory in the UK, why is the EU trying to bring another regulatory framework on top of that when the industry is still in the infant level? The shale gas has not even started. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. I would suggest that we do it now the other way around. We start with Frank, the answers with Frank.
To begin with, one of the issues Benny mentioned, climate protection versus energy supply security. And I would agree that in many respects climate protection was in the past more important than supply security, despite the fact that we always have referred to supplies of security. In respect to the shale gas discussion, one major factor in this discussion is not being mentioned. Because shale gas, from my perspective, as we put it in also in our report, is supporting all 3 objectives of the energy triangle. Energy supply security, because it's a domestic source. Economic competitiveness, yes, it will be certainly more expensive than in the United States because of our environmental regulations, but also about geological conditions, because it's deeper, so the production costs are higher. However, it's a domestic source. You don't need to build a very expensive, long transport pipeline system, yeah, if you have those resources in your own country. That makes domestic shale gas resources more expensive than in the US, but certainly less expensive than Russian gas in the future. The third point is completely ignored on the European side, because it also supported climate protection. Why? Most of the opponents of shale gas resources pointing to a variety of environmental risks, which I cannot address for reasons of time. But in terms of emissions, it's to some extent true if you compare that with coal. Yeah? But even Greenpeace adherents admit sometimes their major concern is not actually the real environmental dangers it may create. The real reason why environmental groups and Greens are against shale gas resources, because it may blockade the expansion of renewables. But in terms of emissions, it's overlooked. Emissions are measured just on the production side. If you analyze life cycle emission analysis, which includes the transport ways, be it on long pipeline systems, be it on ships transported as LNG. And if you compare it with domestic shale gas resource production, for example, yes, the emissions in this respect will be 10 to 30% lower. Yeah, if you compare, for example, Europe's own shale gas resources, if they would be explored, in comparison, for example, with Russia's, which are transported thousands of kilometers of the entire chain of gas infrastructures where emissions are emitted, and not just on the production side. This fact is completely ignored in the European discussion. Secondly, to Iran, despite sometimes closer relations between Russia and Iran, also talks of creating a gas OPEC, I think Russia has no interest at all that the sanctions will be lifted and Iran will become an exporter of oil and particularly gas. It has the second largest oil and gas resources in the world, and the production costs will certainly much, much lower than the Russian production costs. And I had been in 2008 in Iran when the Iranians were so actively discussing all kinds of export options and connected to the Nabucco pipeline at that time. And they also wanted to export all the Caspian gas, being prevented to build a Trans-Caspian pipeline from Turkmenistan to Azerbaijan, instead of favoring that Turkmenistan will export its gas to Iran, and then from Iran it will be further transported to Europe. So Russia has no strategic interest, I think, in seeing any kind of competition with Iran where its gas is certainly much cheaper. Thirdly, to the point of Friedbert, in terms of the interdependence. Firstly, it's certainly true, and I would also agree with you that Russia has a very reliable supplier for Western Europe, for Germany in particular, but it has not been a reliable exporter to the Baltics, to the Poles, and of the new EU member states. So the question for Germany and others is if they would always repeat this kind of argument, because it would reveal ultimately a thinking of national energy policies at the expense of a common energy policy of the EU, and at the expense of those states which are up to 100% still, yeah, on just one supplier. It's not just Russia, it's just one Russian company so far. Yeah? And in respect to your question of the costs of those diversification, I think we all learned the lessons of 2009 when the gas directive had been initiated and all the gas interconnectors being built between EU member states, which were not connected as before. You may have some higher investment costs by building some LNG terminal as the Poles did, as the Baltics do. And also with investment costs of building these interconnectors. But in the mid and long term, everyone will benefit from a variety of import options, which also changes your own power in the relations with Russia. So even regardless if we would use our own shale gas resources or not, we already have more power in our relationship with Russia because of the variety of other import options available, which has already decreased the gas prices over the last 2 years. And the last point, and by the way, as I said, Russian gas supplies becoming much, much more expensive in the future. So the economic question will be more on the table, whether other import option will not only be more secure, but also more affordable, more cheaper than those Russian options. Even the Russian energy ministry has warned Gazprom by 2016, when the next wave of LNG becomes on the global market, Russian or Gazprom exports might be no longer competitive enough. And the last point is very shortly to Asia and Japan. I just came back from Korea, where we discussed the liberalization of the Asian gas markets with Japan in the leadership. You mentioned that Japan has been the biggest importer of LNG already before the Fukushima event. And the effect of the Fukushima event was, of course, that it increased even more LNG, a very costly option. You mentioned the price, which is the most costly But Japan, being the largest importer of LNG, can theoretically rapidly change that situation. As the Japanese government has just announced a few weeks ago, it is not totally phasing out the nuclear option as it was planned before, at least not in the midterm future. We will see that at least some of the reactors may restart over the next years. And if that will be the case, then LNG's import demand will tremendously drop, and even to an extent that it has an impact on the global gas markets, as we have seen it before in 2010 and 2011, when LNG options and LNG prices were 40% cheaper than pipeline prices. Yeah? So Japan is here for the LNG market a very, very critical factor, which can rapidly change the situation on the markets. Yeah? So I'm not debating now whether that's the most realistic option or not, or how many reactors may restart, but just mentioning that it's not clear that the tight situation on the LNG market will indeed last until around 2016 or 2018, when Australia will becoming the largest exporter of LNG, and when much more also LNG becomes available from Africa and other exporters.
Thank you.
I can just brush very briefly on some of the comments and questions that were asked. Peter pointed out, I think for what we see, the North Sea and the Baltic markets look quite well placed, as it's been mentioned quite a few times, there's a lot of domestic reserves left, and LNG markets look quite well placed to support it. So the question is more in Central and Southeastern Europe. And there you can't just pop up LNG terminals. So you have all sorts of options being floated, South Stream obviously being one of them. And there are a lot of European members and new European members as well who are very vocal about their support for it. Bulgaria's energy minister last week came out with a fuming support and a very, very anti-European approach to South Stream. But also Austria, Italy. OMV signed a deal yesterday with a memorandum of understanding with Gazprom to go ahead. Saipem of Italy did it as well. So the support there isn't gone by far. It's more of a dispute between member states and Brussels, the way we hear it. But also in Central and Southeastern Europe, you could see a certain switch towards other fuels. Whether they're popular in the public or Brussels is another debate, because it could involve, as mentioned, more coal, it could involve new nuclear power stations, renewables, and so forth. And of course there is Eastern Mediterranean gas to consider, and maybe Central Asian gas, which could also go a little bit further into that area. But there's no easy fix in that region. If you go towards a more European level, what we always feel is, and hear a lot, is the overall Russian share of the gas market in Europe isn't actually the issue. 30% is it's a lot, but it's not that much. I mean, Norway has 25%, and even if all the reductions that I mentioned earlier actually happen, Russia's share would just drop to 120 BCM to Europe, which is equivalent to Norway's share. The question is more to solve the bottlenecks, again, in Southeast Europe and Northeast Europe. So the question is to reduce Southeast Europe's dependence from 100% to maybe 50%, as Poland has already managed. And maybe the share in Spain or Britain, as our domestic reserves here decline, of Russian gas goes from sort of 5% to 20%, which wouldn't be the end of the world. So it's not an overall question of the supply, it's addressing certain bottlenecks. And on the last point of the global issues, what I find quite interesting at the moment is, obviously Russia is looking a lot to China at the moment. They're hoping to sign the pipeline deal with China in May. They've delayed it a lot, but they're very confident they'll manage this time around. And if you build that pipeline from Russia to China, you are also enabling, finally, Gazprom to begin LNG exports from Vladivostok. Vladivostok LNG exports will probably be the best placed LNG terminal in Asia. It's right across the ocean from Japan, it's close to South Korea, it's close to the east coast of China. Suddenly you are looking at Gazprom becoming a marginal player in the LNG market to becoming an extremely powerful player in the LNG market. They have, for that reason, put their LNG trading office in Singapore, not London or Geneva or anything like that. It's in Singapore that they're looking at. So suddenly in the next 10 years, you might actually be looking at the United States competing with Russia in the Asian LNG market. I mean, we've been babbling on all day long about Europe and Russia and American influence here, but in all that pivot to Asia kind of thing, if Russia also pivots to that area, as a journalist, that'd be very interesting to see how the LNG market of Russia and North America compete in Asia. It's, and Yamal LNG, by the way, is also one that's looking at Asia. One as an analyst, academic, and journalist to look forward to, in certain aspect.
Thank you, Anna. Petra.
Yeah, I just want to address two aspects, and this is to remind ourselves how much politics is involved in this. The interesting thing I find is, as I mentioned, that the US and Canada actually has been very vocal in presenting themselves as, you know, saviors or possibilities sort of that would help Europe in that kind of problem that we have at the moment. In the US, I would argue it's more companies than it is government because of the limitations of the regulatory regime. And in Canada, definitely both companies and governments like to make that point. What for me is interesting to see, we mentioned Norway, right? I mean, Norway is, depending on where, for example, their Arctic oil and gas is moving. And for me, it's interesting to see how Norway hasn't made, you know, these kind of political statements. And probably the reason is because they know how, you know, how very complex that relationship with Russia is. And that maybe making these advances towards Europe, whilst they may be driven also by economic considerations, but certainly by geopolitical ones, is not necessarily the most helpful way of engaging at the moment. I'm really interested, I mean, I'm not such an expert on Norway, but to see that in all those discussions, what we haven't heard is, for example, the Norwegians saying, well, but, you know, maybe we could provide more, possibly because the Norwegians have a history of dealing with Russia, and possibly they know a lot better about these situations than, say, you know, the current Canadian or US government or companies that are over. So this is, for me, a very interesting politics. The other politics, and very quickly, we've all read about what Donald Tusk was suggesting in the Financial Times about this, you know, European Energy Union. But if you looked at it, what he suggested was very much driven by sort of, you know, a member state and its particular interests. Of course, it's not surprising that he would talk about coal, but also what he was suggesting is essentially a seller's cartel or an agreement, you know, let Europe be a good seller, a good buyer, sorry, and then approach Russia. That, for me, is not energy union. And for us, for those of us historians who have looked at the discussions in the 1950s, with, you know, the sort of the discussion, should the European community actually also be an energy community, it's a far cry from that. And for me, you know, that is politics, which brings you to the last point. It's a political decision that has made energy policy more than energy policy. I think we need to accept that energy policy is not a policy field that we can think without looking at climate change policies, industrial policies, and so on. It's a conscious choice that we have made, but I think that explains why we cannot simply go back to what is cheapest, because I think we have made a conscious political choice that climate change is also important, and hence we've made those links.
Thank you. I think it was very important that you said the letter. Eric, most questions went to you, which is understandable.
Okay.
So take your time.
Train ticket. On the question from The Economist on the LNG capacity and what we can do about it, it's true that a lot of the capacity is in the east, but there are projects in the Baltics, for example. We know that Lithuania is moving forward with its Independence floating terminal, aptly named. We have been in close contact with the Estonians and the Finns on both an interconnector and the related possible LNG infrastructure. But it's true that it is supposed to be mainly commercially driven, building LNG terminals. And as we've seen in Spain, that hasn't always proven up until now to be particularly profitable. So it's a delicate balance that needs to be found. The question from the LSE on the effect of the crisis, of the Ukrainian crisis on the 2030 strategy. Well, the Commission came forward with its proposal early January, so at a point in time when this was not yet such a crisis, although of course we have already had the non-signature of the association agreement. But it is clear in any case that the debate on 2030 has been very much one about how do we rebalance the three summits of the pyramid: climate policy, competitiveness policy, and security of supply policy. And I think this also answers partially at least, the question from the gentleman from the Global Warming Policy Foundation. The debate has been very comprehensive and very focused on saying we're not going to give up climate change policy. Most member states do not want to give up climate change policy, and all of the big member states are in that group. The UK first and foremost in a way, Germany, France, Italy, among them, supported by many small member states. So it's not a question of saying we're going to throw climate policy overboard in favor of security of supply. And to make that point, my understanding is that among the countries that were pushing for the Commission to actually work very quickly on this energy security action plan were countries that are very much in favor of pushing renewable energy as a source of domestic energy that actually increases our security of supply. So I'm not saying they're right or they're wrong, I'm just saying you can look at this from different perspectives. There are many who would say pushing forward more ambitiously with our renewables policy, which are linked to the climate change policy obviously, is a way in the medium term of securing a much higher degree of energy independence instead of swapping one supplier for another. So that's an interesting point to remember. To say that climate change policy the EU has inflicted itself with these issues through its climate policy, to me leaves aside the fact that more or less at the same time as the EU decided the 2020 goals, it also started pushing forward all the plans and all the legislation to complete the internal energy market, which includes also the infrastructure to ensure reverse flows within Europe, which include the unbundling of operators in order to have a much more efficient market. So the EU has had a twin strategy at least, one which is ambitious indeed in terms of climate change, but the other which is very much anchored in economic reality and also in the need to have a market that supports security of supply. And the creation of the Connecting Europe facility, the PCI process, etc., now further reinforces that. So it's not as if we were, living in cloud cuckoo land, completely unaware of the realities, but there are constituencies that have priorities that we need to reconcile, bring together, and this is what gives this complex picture of European policy making. I'm focusing just on the questions that were really addressed to me. How long will the EU import US gas? Well, first we would have to start importing US gas before we could start considering that question. But just if you look at the 2050 roadmaps, to give you a rather theoretical answer, and although I don't know them in that detail, but fundamentally gas is seen as a sort of transition fuel. It's not as if we are supposed to lock ourselves into gas dependency in the long term. This is something which is supposed to help us on the way to a decarbonized energy system. So it is a dimension that we need to keep into mind. New developments on South Stream, the short answer is no. Discussions ongoing. Thank you very much. Finally, last question from a gentleman on the EU imposing new constraints on member states when it comes to shale gas. Well, what the Commission did in January is adopt a recommendation, no binding legislation, simply a recommendation to member states to look at and, if necessary, adapt their national legislation when it comes to high-volume hydraulic fracturing. both for exploration and for exploitation, in particular when it comes indeed to environmental assessments, to information to the public about the sort of chemicals that are used, about the impact on the water, etc., etc. But there is no legislation coming from Brussels on this. There was indeed a significant debate as to whether we should propose legislation or not, and in the end it was decided not to propose legislation on this subject for the moment. I think I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for addressing us, to answering the questions, to coming here, to all of you. I think we had hope you share that view, that we had a fascinating discussion, which gave an enormous amount of information. Let me just say, first of all, our next workshop will be, Carola, 17th of June. 17th of June here on Iraq. Probably Iraq, perhaps Iran. So we're discussing the various diversification fields that were very nicely put in your chart. Before we knew that chart, so we have all these fields and discuss them one by one. 17th of June, and I'd be happy to see you here. A second thing, I would like to hint to King's Executive Summer School. EUCERS is doing, as in the last 2 years, an executive summer school for young executives from institutions, from businesses, from June 13th to 4th of July, where you have in one week a very intensive week of being confronted with almost all subjects of international energy politics, from financing of cross-border projects to nuclear, climate policy, renewables, gas and oil. So it's a very comprehensive program. Frank Umbach will lead that seminar. We have great experiences. If you're interested, please take one of these, or Carola will give you additional information. And thirdly, I would like to thank Carola Gegenbauer once again for the great job she does for EUCERS as our head of operations here, and of organizing also this workshop. Thank you very much, Carola. So all the best for all of you.